Hi folks, welcome to another edition of Honors Biology. Today I'm going to share with you some information about pedigrees, and most of you will remember doing this probably in middle school. Pedigrees are a way for scientists and geneticists to track either genotypes or maybe disorders through a lineage in a family. And so we can keep track of which individuals in a family have a disorder and which ones don't. So for this part of today's assignment, I need you to turn in your Honors Biology workbook to page 62. And we've taken notes about halfway through page 62, and we're going to start in that middle point again today. So if you go ahead and find your page 62, we are starting in the middle here. And that question says, draw a pedigree below and explain what the shapes and the shading mean. So that's where we're going to start today. So a couple of things that I want to remind you about before we jump into more pedigree information. So things that you're going to need to know about pedigrees. First, a pedigree is really just a picture of how a trait is passed from parents to offspring. And there are lots of things that we can include in a pedigree. So some basics first. Our circles, like this one right here, always represent females, and our squares always represent males. And this is their biological gender. So just keeping that in mind. Anytime you see in a pedigree a horizontal line, it may indicate either a marriage or it may indicate a mating. And so that just means that that's a couple that may or may not be married or have offspring. From that horizontal line, if there's a vertical line down, like this one, it indicates that that pairing has had offspring. So these are the three children right here of my original mom and dad. If any of the squares or circles are shaded, that indicates that the individual has the disorder. Like this person right here, he has whatever disorder it is we're tracing. Individuals that are not shaded do not have the disorder. So they're not going to be affected by whatever trait it is we're following through a pedigree. And then finally, if you ever have an individual like this one here, who's partially shaded in, like halfway, just like that circle is, it means that they're a carrier. So they're going to be heterozygous for a trait. They're going to carry that allele that causes the disorder. Now, not all pedigrees are going to always represent recessive disorders. Some pedigrees trace dominant disorders, and we'll talk about that a little bit at the end of today's video. But just so that you know, not all pedigrees show recessive disorders. So let's take a minute, and I want you to answer the Ed Puzzle questions that pop up now. Okay, if you've done that, you're ready for the next part of today's information. We are going to pause here. So go ahead and just click pause on your slideshow. And I want you to draw any example of a pedigree in the middle of your notes and just explain what the circles and the squares mean, as well as the shading, and then explain why a pedigree is used. So we're going to put that on the question in our notes on the middle of page 62. And you can pause me here to do that. Okay, if you're back with me, you've finished that question in the middle of page 62. And now we're moving on to actually working with a pedigree and drawing what we can put on a pedigree in terms of information. So the example that I have for you here is a tricky one. We are going to draw a pedigree for a colorblind trait. And remember, before we start, colorblindness is a sex-linked trait that is also recessive. So anytime we have a sex-linked trait, just to refresh your memory, when we did our Punnett squares last class period with sex-linked traits, we always included the sex chromosomes. So if we are girls, we put XX, and if we're boys, we would put XY. And we're going to do the same thing on our pedigree. So this says, make a pedigree chart for the following couple. Dana is colorblind. Her husband, Jeff, is not. They have 2 boys and 2 girls. So let's take a look at what this could potentially look like. I'm going to have you draw this in your notes. So we're going to first draw a circle for Dana, and we're going to shade that circle in. And you can draw this on the bottom of page 62. And the reason we shade Dana's circle in is because it says that Dana is colorblind. Then we're going to put a horizontal line connecting her to a square, who is Jeff. And it says that Jeff is not colorblind. So those things should be in your notes. Then it says they have 2 boys and 2 girls. So we're going to draw a line down that indicates that they have 2 boys and 2 girls. And then we're going to take a look at those 2 boys and 2 girls. Sorry, I'm going to go backwards here. Whoops. Okay, so we've got our 2 boys and 2 girls. Now let's take a look at how we come up with whether these are shaded or not. So first, remember that this is a sex-linked trait. And when we, sorry, my mouse and presentation is going haywire here. Okay, super frustrating. My apologies. When we look at this disorder, we remember that it's a sex-linked disorder. And I told you before, with any sex-linked disorder, we're going to include the sex chromosomes in our pedigree. And the goal of any pedigree is to write the genotypes of the individuals in that pedigree. So as I'm looking at this pedigree, and you can ignore this and this for now, because I'm going to draw these with you. The very first thing we do on a sex-linked pedigree to fill in the genotypes is we put in the sex chromosomes. And so under every square on your pedigree, I want you to go ahead and put an X and a Y, an X and a Y. And under every circle on your pedigree, because these are females, we're going to put an X and another X. Because we know girls get an X from their mom and an X from their dad, and boys get an X from their mom and a Y from their dad. So if I go back up to the description up here, it says Dana is colorblind, and we've colored her in. And remember that colorblindness is a sex-linked recessive trait, which means it's only on the X chromosome. So just as a reminder, when we're filling out pedigrees that are sex-linked, these are pedigrees that are, or genotypes that are only on the X chromosome. So if mom has the disorder, she is going to have to be X little n, because the only way she can have the disorder is to have 2 recessive copies. Our description also says that dad does not have the disorder, and his square is not colored in, so he must have a capital N because he doesn't have the disorder. And remember, with any sex-linked trait, we do not put anything over here next to the Y because it's missing that DNA segment that would carry that gene. So boys only get a single copy. Now, you can tell that the 2 boys that this couple has have to have the disorder. And the reason they have the disorder and are colored in is because their X chromosome came from their mom. And their mom can only pass on a lowercase n. Now, we're not going to put anything in the Y chromosome because the Y chromosome does not carry this gene. The Y chromosome came from dad, but both boys are going to be colorblind. Let's take a look at what happens with the girls over here. The girls get one of their X chromosomes from their dad. That's how they became girls in utero. And they get a X chromosome from their mom. And notice, mom can only give them a lowercase n. So these girls are going to be X capital N, X lowercase n. Remember that we call these individuals carriers because they can carry the recessive trait. And obviously, these girls, if they have their own sons, will be able to pass that trait on to their offspring. So some important things to remember there. Okay, on the bottom of page 62, you should have a picture of this pedigree, and you should have all of the genotypes, which are the letters that these individuals express for this trait, written underneath the circles and squares. You can go ahead and answer the Ed Puzzle questions at this point. They'll pop up on your screen. And then when you're ready, we'll try another example together. Okay, if you're back with me, then we're ready to try another example. This was a tricky example because it was a sex-linked trait, but not all of the traits that we trace on pedigrees are going to be sex-linked. Some of them will be much, much easier to fill out. And so we'll work on an easier example next. In your workbook, you will find that we have a genetic tree, a genetic family tree or a pedigree for tongue rolling. And remember, we talked about that in class. That's the ability to, and not everybody can do that. We are going to fill out this tongue rolling pedigree together, and then you're going to answer some questions in the Ed Puzzle. So I'm going to walk you through this a little bit step by step. First, we know that tongue rolling has nothing to do with our X and Y chromosomes, so this is not sex-linked, which is going to make this a lot easier because we don't have to put the X and Y chromosomes on here. Because it's not sex-linked, this will be a simple straight genetics pedigree. We are going to use big R for rolling. That's the ability to roll your tongue. And then we'll use little r for not rolling. So if you're an individual who can't roll your tongue, you are a homozygous recessive person because you have to have two little r's to not roll your tongue. Okay, these questions are going to pop up in your Ed Puzzle, and you can also answer them in your notes. But just to do a little explanation here, when you see these Roman numerals in front, that indicates the generation. So this would be generation 1, this would be generation 2, and down here would be generation 3. So as you're answering your questions, you should be able to use those kind of as a guide. Now I'm going to help you fill in the genotypes. I'm going to start at the top, and we'll work together on this. If a person has the trait, this is a recessive trait, it means they must be homozygous recessive. That's the only way they can show the trait. So anybody in this pedigree, and we can see the key down here, ours, it says blue shading. Really, ours is not. This is the wrong key for this because the color on this didn't work out. So if these individuals are shaded, they cannot roll their tongue. And if they're not shaded, they can roll their tongue. So you can ignore that. You can ignore that key. It's a little bit confusing there. Okay, so every individual who cannot roll their tongue is going to be shaded. And they must be homozygous recessive because the only way you cannot roll your tongue is by getting 2 copies of the recessive allele, one from mom and one from dad. So that's the easy part of this genotype, or of this pedigree. Now, we know every other person on this pedigree who is not shaded must have at least one big R. So if you wanted to, you could go through and give every single person who is left on our pedigree one big R. And then our job will be to determine what their other allele is for this disorder. Oh, that's not what I meant to do. Excuse me there. Okay, I'm not going to keep putting the big R's in. We'll get to those in a minute. But as I'm looking at these, this mom and this dad had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of their own offspring. Some of them could roll their tongues, like this son right here and this son right here. And some of them could not roll their tongue, like this circle right here and this square right here. So as we think through the rules of inheritance, remember, you get one allele from mom and one allele from dad. So people who cannot roll their tongue got one little R from their mom and one little R from their dad. Well, it's easy to see dad can give a little R because he can't roll his tongue either. But let's look at mom. Mom rolls her tongue, but has offspring who cannot roll her tongue. So that tells you that mom must be heterozygous because the only way her daughter can get the ability to not roll her tongue is from getting a little R from both her mom and her dad. So we know mom's genotype must be big R, little r. Now, let's look at the rest of the offspring that these parents have. We know that this son right here can roll his tongue, and he got the big R from his mom. And we know he had to get an R from his dad, and his dad can only give him a little r because that's the only genotype dad has. So this son is going to be big R, little r. Then we're going to move on to this son right here. Notice he also can roll his tongue. He got a big R from his mom, but he had to get an allele from his dad as well, and his dad can only give him a little r because that's all dad has in his genotype to pass on. And the same is true of their daughter. So she's going to be big R, little r. Okay, now we're going to move down a little bit. Notice, I have not tried to fill in the genotypes of anybody who married into this family yet. And the reason I haven't done that is we don't know their lineage. And so we have to look at their offspring to try to figure out what their genotypes are. And I'm going to start over here because this one's a little bit easier. If I take a look at this daughter, or this woman, she married into the family and mated with this son who was homozygous recessive. That means all of their children will be homozygous recessive because they can only get little r's from both mom and dad. So that's pretty clear. But then this son also had a relationship or reproduced with another woman. And this woman can roll her tongue and also had offspring with the man that shows that neither of their son or daughter can actually roll their tongue. And so as a result of that, as we're looking at this, we know if this daughter got a little r from dad, she also had to get a little r from mom. So mom must be a carrier or heterozygous for this trait. And the same for this offspring here. All right, we're going to work our way down. Over here, there's no way for us to know what this mom is, if she's a little r or a big R. We notice that both of their offspring can roll their tongues, but we don't know if they have a little r and are heterozygous or are homozygous recessive because we don't know what this mom has. So as a result, when there's no way for us to figure out what that other R is, we will often put a R blank. It means that we don't know if they are carriers of the recessive allele or if they are homozygous dominant. They could be either. Okay, let's take a look over here at this part of the pedigree. This is another individual that married into the family. Their offspring are both able to roll their tongues, so they're going to be big R's. But again, we don't know what this mom's other R is because they didn't have any offspring who had the trait. If they did, we would know this would be a little r. Both of their offspring can roll their tongue. And so we're going to put R blank, and R blank here. And finally, as we look at this example, we have this man who married in. Again, we don't know what his genotype is because their offspring are both tongue rollers, but we don't know if they are heterozygous for the trait or homozygous dominant. So we are going to put R blank, R blank. Okay, this is how you complete a pedigree that's not sex linked. And you should have this on page 63 in your notes. I'm going to pause here, or you're going to pause here, and answer some Edpuzzle questions. These questions are going to pop up on Edpuzzle. Go ahead and answer them, and then we'll restart in just a second. All right, folks, if you're with me, we're ready to move on to the next thing. On page 63, there are two more pieces that I need you to do. I want you to just practice drawing a pedigree. And so on page 63, there's a spot in the middle of the page that says pedigree story. I want you to write a story about someone who marries someone and has offspring, and the offspring marry their cousins or something like that. And all I want you to do is draw circles and squares for a story. I want you to tell a story, and then I want you to write a pedigree below that reflects the story. One thing I didn't tell you about pedigrees that I think is important is we always rank our children from the first child that we have to the last child that we have. So when we look at this, this is the first child that was born, and this is their fifth child that's born. So this one's technically the youngest, and I want you to keep that in mind. So you're going to take a minute and pause my video, and you're going to write a quick story and then a pedigree below it. So you could talk about grandparents, and then those grandparents had 5 kids, and the first was a boy, whatever you want to include in your pedigree story, and then draw a pedigree that shows the relationships in that story. You don't have to include any traits, so I'm not asking you to include any shading at this point, but if you would just take a minute and write a pedigree story and then draw your pedigree below, I want you to include at least 3 generations and 10 individuals in your story. All right, folks, if you are with me, if you're back with me, then you restarted your video after you filled out your pedigree story and practiced drawing a pedigree. Right now, I want you to turn to page 64 in your workbooks. And on that page, there's a title that says Genetics Practice Problems, Pedigree Tables. And I'm going to start you on this assignment, and then you will finish it through Edpuzzle and the rest of this video. We're going to do the first one. I'm going to go ahead and start it with you, and then you'll continue the rest of this assignment after I give you some instructions. So in your workbook, the very first pedigree says, first, circles are females and squares are males, which we already know, and a shaded circle or square indicates that a person has the trait that you're tracing, and that's for the whole page 64 through 66 assignment that you're going to be working on. The first pedigree says the pedigree seen below is for color blindness, and the same pedigree is up on your screen right now. Shaded individuals are colorblind. So it says first determine the probable genotype of persons 1 through 15. So that means putting the letters on our pedigree, and then answer the questions below the table. So I'm going to help you with this one. As with all of our pedigrees, the very first question you should ask yourself is this a sex-linked trait or a normally inherited trait? And we know color blindness is sex-linked. And we also know our sex-linked traits are only found on our X chromosomes. So it's going to be important for us to include the gender chromosomes on all the individuals in our pedigree. So before we even begin figuring out what their genotypes are, the first thing we're going to do is put their sex chromosomes on our pedigree. And you can do this with me. Every circle is going to be XX. And I like to do them sort of in order on my pedigree, but you can do this however you want on your page 64. And sometimes I get ahead of myself, so hopefully I'm not making any mistakes as you're watching me. I'm just putting the sex chromosomes. I'm not putting anything else on this pedigree yet. All right, I think all my circles have their sex chromosomes. And then the next thing I do is I go ahead and I put my sex chromosomes for all the men on my pedigree. And remember that these are all XY. So under every single circle and every single square, I should have sex chromosomes. And just to remind you, we only do this. We only add the sex chromosomes if we are certain we are tracing an X-linked trait. And in this case, we are, because it's color blindness. So that's my first step. My second step is to start adding in the genotypes on these chromosomes. And remember, color blindness is a recessive disorder. So if you have the recessive alleles, you will be colorblind. And if you don't have the recessive alleles, you're going to have normal vision. Okay, so as I'm looking at this particular trait here, I know anybody who is shaded is going to be colorblind because they have the recessive allele. So the very first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and fill in any shaded individual. And remember, these individuals can only have the allele on their X chromosome. So this male number 4, has color blindness. He's going to be X(n), and I'm not going to put anything on his Y chromosome because the Y chromosome does not carry the DNA that has this trait. And then I look over here, this square right here, this individual right here also is colorblind. So he is going to be X(n), but nothing next to his Y chromosome. Individual number 8 also is colorblind, so he is going to be X(n), nothing on his Y chromosome. And individual number 12 is going to be X(n) with nothing on the Y chromosome. Then I'm going to take a look and see if I'm missing anybody, and sure enough, I haven't filled out the genotype for individual 13. This is a woman, but she's colorblind. So we know she has X(n), but she has to have 2 copies of this to express the trait because she has 2 X chromosomes. So she is homozygous recessive, X(n), X(n). The next easiest thing to do is to continue filling out all of the males' genotypes. And the reason that's so easy is because if the males don't have color blindness, we know the only allele they're going to have is an X(n), because there's nothing on their Y chromosome. And they only get 1 copy of this gene, so they're going to be X(n), X(n), all the way through my pedigree if they do not have the trait. And I think I got all of the squares filled in. So easiest to do males first. The next thing we do is we fill in our females. Now, this takes a little bit of thought, so I want you to think this through. We're going to start with individual number 3. We know this woman is not colorblind, so she must be X(n). And now we're going to look at her offspring. I want you to notice that individual number 8 has the disorder. He is colorblind. And as you remember about what we learned about sex chromosomes, the X chromosome from a boy always comes from his mother. because the Y chromosome has to come from his dad, which means this boy who is colorblind must have gotten it from his mother. So this mom is a carrier of the disorder. She is X big N, X little n, because she has a son who has the disorder, and his X chromosome had to come from his mother. Then I'm going to take a look at individuals 9 and 10. I know that these daughters do not have color blindness because they're not shaded in. So they're going to be X big N for sure. And that big N had to come from their mom because their dad also gives them the X chromosome that they have. But the only thing their dad can pass on to them is a little n because he's colorblind. So these girls are going to be X big N, X little n. And we know they got their big N from their mom because she is the one who is not colorblind, and the little n from their dad because that's all he could give them. So that's our first section here. We can kind of follow things on over here as well. Notice this mom does not have color blindness, so she's going to be X big N, but she has a son who is colorblind. His X chromosome had to come from his mother, so she must be a carrier of the trait. So she is X big N, X little n. And then I look at individual number 5. We know she does not have the trait, so she is X big N. But here's the tricky part. She could have gotten this big N from either her mom or her dad because they both have X big Ns. And we're not sure what this other X is. If she got this X big N from her dad, she could have gotten X little n from her mom. Or she could have gotten X big N from her mom and her dad. So we don't know. So we're going to put X big N, X line. And that just means we're unsure what her allele is here. Now let's look at individual number 7. We know she's not colorblind, so she's going to be X big N. And if we look at her children, we notice that her children are colorblind. And her son, who got his little n on his X chromosome from his mom, because that's where his X chromosome comes from, tells us that she must be X big N, X little n. Dad is also X little n, which means their daughter here got one little n from mom and one little n from dad. Individual 14 is already done, but individual 15 has 2 copies. We know one is an X big N because she's not colorblind. The only parent she could have gotten that X big N from is her mom because dad is colorblind. We know daughters always get one X from their mom and one X from their dad. So she is also going to be X big N, X little n. You should have filled out all of the genotypes on page 64 in that first example with me. You're going to answer the questions below on page 64 on your own. Some of them may pop up on Edpuzzle. That's a good way for me to check in with you. You are also going to do the pedigree on page 66 on the top of the page. I'm sorry, on page 65 at the top of the page, but don't do the one on the bottom. It mentions blood type. It's this one. It has A's and O's. You're not quite ready to do that one yet. We haven't talked about it. So go ahead and skip that one. And then you're also going to do the last pedigree on page 65. And you need to make sure for all of your pedigrees, you check to see if they are sex linked or not. So read really carefully. And I have some pointers in there that tell you if things are sex linked or if they're a normal recessive pattern. So go ahead and fill those out and answer the Edpuzzle questions that go along with it. right, folks, if you're back with me, then we have one more thing to talk about. I don't know how I got a line there. Um, One other thing I want to mention is sometimes I'm going to ask you if a trait is a recessive trait or a dominant trait. And we haven't practiced with any dominant traits yet, but I'm going to give you some indicators that will tell you if something's a recessive trait or a dominant trait. Sometimes we use pedigrees and we color them in with a dominant trait. And sometimes we use pedigrees to show a recessive trait. One example of a dominant trait that you could trace in family lineages is something called polydactyly, which is six-fingeredness. That's actually a dominant trait. And so you can trace that through families. But I wanted to tell you the things that you're going to look for to determine the difference between a recessive pedigree and a dominant pedigree if the key doesn't tell you. So first, if it is a dominant disorder, the dominant disorder will show up with parents who are affected. So if the kids are affected, typically they have at least one affected parent or maybe two affected parents. So that would be a dominant disorder. So notice anybody who has it had one or two parents that both had it, right? And you can see that as you trace this. A recessive disorder, on the other hand, shows up often when both parents don't have it, but they have a child who does have the disorder. This is an example of a recessive disorder. And take a look here, it happened again. 5 and 6 had a child who had the disorder. And the reason that happens, we know, is because if this is a recessive disorder and mom and dad are both heterozygotes, they could have a child with the disorder. Over here, these parents have big R's, and if you don't have the trait, you're little r, right? And so anybody who has the trait with that big R can possibly pass it on to their offspring, but we're not going to be able to hide the allele like we do with a carrier. This carrier kind of hides this allele, but because in a dominant disorder, this is the allele that's expressed, there's no hiding the allele. So you can't have parents like you do with a recessive disorder who don't have the trait, then have a child who does have the trait. So that's the patterning you're going to look for. The other thing about a recessive disorder is it will sometimes skip generations. So like mom and dad might not have it, but their children will. And so on. So those are some tips that you can use to tell the difference between a dominant or a recessive pedigree. And if it were me, I would include that on anywhere in your notebook, kind of as just a side note. So I might put it at the bottom of your pedigree notes that we took earlier. And that's totally up to you, but you should have somewhere in your notes how we can tell the difference between an autosomal dominant and an autosomal recessive disorder. And when I say autosomal, that's on a chromosome that's not sex-linked. So we've talked about some things that are sex-linked, only on the X chromosome. Autosomal is any other chromosome in your body except your sex chromosomes. Okay, if you are finished with your notes and your worksheet pages, you can take pictures of those and submit them to me and make sure that you answered all your Edpuzzle questions and you are finished. I will dismiss you at the end of class, so hang on the Zoom call until then, and I hope it went well. Let me know if you have any questions when I see you on our Zoom call. Thanks, everybody. Bye.